The main goal of this paper is to try to provide a general explanation for the variation in marriage rates that we observe for the period for which we have data, which turns out to be about for the past 100 years. And more specifically, we will try to provide a unifying explanation for marriage booms, marriage declines that we observe during these periods, trends that we see during the past century, and also we will try to use one explanation to explain changes in marriage rates across races, and we will focus on whites and blacks. Now, we believe it's important to explain changes in marriage rates, mostly because marital patterns, changes in marital patterns, have strong implications for many variables that are of interest not only to economists, but also to social scientists in general and to policymakers. For instance, changes in marital patterns are important for children's welfare and education, as we learned today. They're important for labor force participation and hours of work, for income inequality. Some recent article in the news claim that part of the income inequality is due to the rise of single parent families. Fertility choices are affected by marital changes. Fraction of individuals on wealth are believed to be affected by changes in marital patterns. Now, in spite of this fact that understanding the marriage market is important to understand a large set of important variables, there is no, if you look at the literature, at least this is our reading of the literature, there is no general explanation for the variation in marriage rates over this long period. And this doesn't mean that there is no explanation. There are many explanations, and I will go over them quickly in a couple of slides, but we couldn't find any explanation that that can explain the data that we observe for the past century. And this is where our paper comes in. The main contribution of this paper is to provide a unifying explanation for this variation in marriage rates for the US economy that we observe for the past century. In particular, what we will show in this paper is that one variable by itself, and this variable is a cohort size, can explain almost the entire variation in US marriage rates since the beginning of the 20th century. And you will see that the relationship is a negative relationship in the sense that an increase in cohort size generates a decline in marriage rates, and an increase in cohort size has the opposite effect. Now, in the second part of the paper, we develop a simple search model of the marriage market, and we show that theoretically it can account for this negative relationship between cohort size and marriage rates. Then we derive a testable implication of the model, and we test it using the US data, and we cannot reject our simple search model. Given that I only have 41 minutes now, it's unlikely I will be able to go over the theoretical part. I'll only be able to go over the empirical part. So I'll give you a brief overview of what we do in the theoretical part of the paper. So here as I said, we develop a simple search model of the marriage market, and that can generate the pattern that we observe in the data. And to generate these patterns, we need only one main assumption. And the main assumption is that the value for women of being in the marriage market declines faster than the value for men. And this assumption is justified by two. It declines faster with time. So for women, their value of being married is higher when they're young than when they're old. Sorry? So yeah, so it declines with time, with age. And this this assumption is justified by two facts. So the first one is that women are fertile for a shorter period of time, and relative to men. The second one is that the general belief is that the main reason for marriage, or one of the main reasons for marriage, is to have and raise children. So if you believe in these two facts, then it follows directly that the value of women, of being in the marriage market, declines with age faster than for men. An extreme case of this, which is the one we consider in the model, is when women are in the marriage market only when younger, and men are in the marriage market when younger and older. Now, in this, with this assumption, we can generate the pattern that I just described for the data as follows. Think, for instance, about a situation where there is an increase in cohort size. If you have an increase in cohort size, then the older men that are present in the marriage market becomes a scarce resource. And as a consequence, we have a mechanical effect that younger women, or women, these are the only one in the market, women will be less likely to meet older men, and therefore the marriage rate will go down. There is a second effect, and the second effect...
Is it going to be a two-period model then, basically?
In this case, we have a two-stage model. So when we also estimate...
Otherwise, you think it'd be the whole pattern of cohort size.
Yeah, you can. So the model that we use generates the result. If you have several stages of life, actually probably it's even easier to generate the results. But given that we proved two results theoretically, working with two stages is easier. When we structurally estimate the model, we allow for multiple years. So each stage is 10 years. So. Yes. Yes.
So if I'm 20, I might say, well, maybe I'll get married when I'm 50. I have to know what the cohorts after me are going to look like.
Yeah. So in the model, what we assume, in the model, when we prove this result, so let me finish the intuition, then I talk about this. So you have this increasing cohort. One effect is that women marry less because they're less likely to marry older men. The second effect is that the younger man becomes more selective because now they know that if they meet a woman whose quality is not high enough, they can wait for next period and still select among a large number of women. Now, to do this, I'll show you, you will see in the data that the shocks that we see to cohort size are permanent. There is a strong persistence. So we look at permanent shocks to cohort size in the theoretical model.
Is cohort size endogenous in this process?
Cohort size in the model is assumed to be exogenous. In the empirical part, we will use an instrument to show causality.
I was thinking, that obviously, if you've got more marriages, you're going to have a larger cohort size.
Yeah, so we don't account for that in the... we don't account for that in the theoretical model.
But in the baby boom, just going back, the baby boom is a case where you had, even at the same marriage rates, much greater fertility. So it's just hard to imagine that as completely exogenous to some model of marriage.
I agree. So that's an assumption that we make, and this is why in the empirical part, we account for the endogeneity. In the theoretical model, so in this case, what we are doing with the theoretical model is trying to test the model whether it's consistent with the data. If we were doing policy, then I think this would be much more important. But in the model, right now, we are only doing testing of the model. So I think it's, we can show that we can generate the results, we can match the pattern very well.
Just to understand the flavor of your model. So there is only one marriage market, right? It's not stratified by age. So any man can marry any woman of any age, and there is no preference.
There is no preferences for young or old. We have two stages when they can get married, and then they'll be single or married later on, depending on what they choose. In the first stage, they are young, and we have both young men and young women. In the second stage, we only have older men. Okay? There is no preferences. There is no, they meet someone that can be old and young, and they decide whether to get married or not. Okay?
So can you repeat the mechanism? So you've got suddenly a big cohort.
You have suddenly a big cohort coming in. Then older men, they're already there because they made choices in previous periods. There are fewer of them in relative terms. So women are less likely to meet an older man. So this reduces the marriage rate, right?
So the older women go out of the market, and the
older
older men
women go out of
don't,
the market.
and
They're
the older
not
men
fertile,
don't.
so
that's why it's
so you only have the younger one, and then the younger men become more selective.
So basically, the increase in the cohort size shifts the sex ratio against women.
Yeah.
Shift the sex ratio against women, and therefore you have the effect on older men. You meet them less, and younger men becomes more selective.
Maurizio, but this, if men become more selective, so the ones who remain unmarried, they should have more desirable marriage market characteristics than women who remain unmarried. And I thought that at least in the last 30, 40 years of US data, men who are unmarried tend to be negatively selected, so have bad characteristics, or education, or wages, and so on. So I guess the model would have, if you had the heterogeneity and some characteristics that determines the marriageability, they would have implications about the selection.
But what you're saying is not conditioning on cohort size. You need to condition.
This is not conditioning on cohort
you need to
size.
condition on cohort size.
Yeah, but that's sort of an interesting interaction.
Yeah, it's a good point. So what you're saying is that condition on cohort size, we can look at the selection. Yeah, we haven't done that. Yeah, it's a good point. Okay, so but during this presentation, I'll talk about the empirical part because I think the results are interesting, so I'll focus on that. And the model is on, if you're interested about the details, it's in the paper that I sent to the conference, so it should be available. So let me go briefly over the literature. There are several papers that have tried to explain changes in marriage rates. That's too fast. So several papers have tried to use income as a possible explanation for changes in marriage rates. But the explanation as income as an underlying theory for all these centuries of changes in marriage rates can be rejected. There are some papers that have rejected this particular hypothesis. Other people have claimed that the adoption of fertility technologies has reduced the number of the marriage rates, but this can only account for changes around the 70s, cannot account for changes before the introduction of the pill or the larger adoption of the abortion. So other people have claimed that declining prices of appliances or increasing quality may explain this. But even this cannot be the unifying explanation because prices have been declined since the 50s, quality has been going up since the 50s, and you will see that there are cycles in the marriage rates. Some people have claimed that different policies like incarceration and welfare aids can explain the changes in marriage rates, and we believe that they have an effect, like the pills, we believe it has an effect for the 70s. But this only applied to specific periods, like the increased incarceration for the black population. Welfare aids actually has been rejected by some papers. When you look at the longitudinal variation, they are not consistent with the pattern observed in the data. There is an interesting theory by Easterling called the consumption aspiration theories that has been rejected for periods after World War II. And finally, the theory that is the closest to ours is the sex ratio theory. It's related to what we do because in our mechanism, part of the explanation is due to changes, the endogenous change of sex ratios. But if you look at the empirical evidence about this, they look at specific cases, case studies, or specific periods. So the rest of the...
Can I just ask a question? Given the fact that baby booms, these fluctuations in cohort size aren't completely independent, right? Because the baby boom produced a baby boomlet. How do you know that, some of these explanations aren't enough when you take essentially one of these theories which is going to explain, you got to back up and explain something related to the early part of the 20th century, for sure. But you don't have to, you're making the point that there are more booms and busts, but that's partly because there are booms and, there's fluctuations to the cohort size change. Once you have a cohort size change, right, it tends to propagate.
Okay, but what you're saying is that cohort size explain this. So.
Well,
No.
No.
So
I'm saying
then
that
I
whatever
missed-
caused wait, no, it's going. What I'm
So,
saying
yeah,
is
I
whatever
misunderstood.
caused cohort size to change, right, and which may have been one or two events, it could have exchanged the entire.
So yeah, that's true. So what you're saying is that there could be something underlying the cohort size.
Wars and migration policy, and also the state of the economy that would sort of encourage migration or discourage it. I mean,
Absolutely.
those would all be related. Those are substantial cohort movements.
Absolutely. So you're right. So here we're taking cohort size, our main variable. You will see that we use as part of the variation that we believe is exogenous, try to get at the causality, meaning that the cohort size really generates this effect. But you could be right that one of these variables changes cohort size, and cohort size affect the marriage rate. You're absolutely right. Now I understand. Yeah.
But you're going to show us, you were sort of rejecting these, just like a point made earlier, you're rejecting these explanations one at a time, but if you put them all together, how well does that explain the overall change in the marriage rate? I mean, because each of these is operating in different periods. You've had expansions, you've had contractions, you've had various kinds of, like you mentioned, the pill and so forth. I'm just wondering, I've never seen anybody put it together.
I don't know. The answer is that we haven't
So you're
tried.
not going to put it
know.
together today?
Sorry?
You're not going to try to look at competing explanations?
No.
All the competing explanations?
No, we will not. We will show you the evidence about cohort size, which I think it's very strong, but you're right. We haven't done that. Maybe this is something we should think about, but we haven't looked at that.
And as a factual question, how many people marry outside their group?
During the period we are looking at, you mean within race?
Well, religion, group, different kinds of groups.
So in this, so we will look at why.
There's differential expansion of these groups is the point. It would get you some mileage.
So we will show you we will show you the markets for whites and blacks. The number that marry across races is very small during this period. Now it's become more frequent, but
even across ethnic groups or religious groups.
The religious groups, I don't know. We only look at whites and blacks. We can look maybe at that to see.
Because right now the marriage market is everybody in all groups, you're assuming, or is it some kind of segmentation?
So right now we only segment the whites from blacks. So I'll only be able to present the empirical evidence. First I will show you our results using longitudinal variation. Then we will look at cross-state variation. And finally, to hopefully answer some of the question, we try to find some exogenous variation in a cohort size to see whether we can claim causality of cohort on marriage rates. And we will use the mobilization rates during World War II to do this. And as I said, it's unlikely I will be able to talk about the model. Now, before going into the details of the paper, I want to show you the results on which that started the whole project and on which the whole paper is based. And so let me point out that I'll give you all the details of how we construct this graph. So in a few minutes, I'll tell you everything about all these variables. So here we have on the horizontal axis the year of birth of a particular cohort. The red line is the share never married by age 30 for women. And I will show you the results by age 25, 35, and 40 later on. The blue line is the same share for men, and the green line is cohort size. And we have this for both whites and blacks. So focus for the moment only for cohorts that are born before 1960. And you can see that there is a very strong correlation between cohort size and the share never married. When the cohort size goes down, the share of married goes down for both men and women. When it goes up for both, the share never married goes up for both men and women. And what was surprising for us was that this strong correlation was satisfied for both the white and the black population. And we were surprised because in all this literature, people tried to look at these two markets as separate markets. And at least in terms of these relationships, is similar for both black and white.
Scales are off. The scales are very different.
Oh, the scale. So here we needed to normalize the cohort size. Oh, you mean for what? For whites and blacks? Oh, yeah. The scales are quite different. The scales are different because here there is a larger imbalance between, at the time of people enter in the marriage market, between men and women. This creates the scale difference. So now, now let's consider, so the problem with these graphs is that we have this strong correlation only until we get to the cohort born 1960s and later, and then we lose the correlation. And here I was lucky to have a good cohort who suggested that the individuals born on and after 1960 are the ones that enter the marriage market around the 1980s, 1990s. And this is when cohabitation became a close substitute to marriage. So what we decided to do is to add a cohabitation to our empirical analysis. So here what I'm showing you is the share never married and not cohabiting. So now cohabitation is considered a close substitute to marriage, so we treat it in the same way by age 30.
By
so
not cohabiting, do you mean never cohabited?
Actually, yeah, that's a good point. So here we only have information about current cohabiting, okay? So we can only include these individuals if they are currently cohabiting. That means that we're underestimating the number of cohabiting individuals because they could have cohabited in the past. So it's only the ones that are cohabiting when we see them in the survey. So it's the fraction, you see? So actually we found a data set that has information on the history of cohabitation, and we are going to check how often we are. But what's interesting here is that if you introduce a cohabitation, then we get back the strong correlation between cohort size and the share never married, even after 1960. And we do this, we get back this correlation both for the whites and the blacks. So now in the rest of the talk, in the remaining 23 minutes, I will do robustness checks to determine whether this is robust to different specifications, different type of variations, and we will try to determine whether there is a causal relationship between cohort size and the share never married. Now, the data, we use the national vital statistics to measure cohort size across races and for different cohorts. And when we look at the state level, also across the states, for the share ever or never married, we use the CPS for as many cohorts as possible, and then we use the US Census for earlier cohorts. When we look at the mobilization rates, we use the Selective Services Special Monograph to measure the variation in mobilization rates across states. Now, so in this paper, we believe we make a first contribution, which is methodological. And the first contribution is to show that the measures that people have used in the past to analyze the evolution of the marriage market can be problematic. And these are the two measures that are generally used: the number of marriages divided by the population, and the share of individuals married within an age range. The standard measure is between the age range is between 18 and 30. And these two measures, so this is the first measure. So it's marriages divided by population. And this measure has one big problem, is that it is very sensitive to changes in the population. There could be situations where the population increases a lot because there is a baby boom, and there is no change in marriages. And this measure will suggest that the marriage rates went down even if there is no actual change. So you can derive the wrong inference using this particular measure. Now, this is the second measure that people use, the share of women ever married within an age range. Now, this has another effect. And the problem is that it confounds two different effects. One is the one you want to capture, the change in the number of marriages. And the second one is the age of first marriage. If the age of first marriage increases or decreases over the period, then once again you draw the wrong inference.
No, but your theoretical models, in a sense, say something about this, right? Because you have something like the percentage number of women who marry older women. That's exactly.
Theoretically, yes, but empirically, I will show you that it can create big problems. I will show you in one slide. So theoretically, you can do that, and this is what we do. Actually, that's the testable implication. Oh, let me mention what is the testable implication that we have in the model before I forget about that. So what we show in the model is that if our model is correct, then an increase in cohort size should reduce the difference in age between spouses of marriage, and vice versa if there is a decline in cohort size. And this is something we test in the data, and we cannot reject the model. Actually, this is what happens in the model. So we can do that in the model. The model can account for this type of differences. But in the data, you will see that this is problematic. Now, we believe that a better measure to capture variation in the marriage rates is the share of individuals in a given cohort married by a given age, let's say by age 30 or by age 40. And the main advantage of this is that we don't have this problem with the changes in population because we use a consistent measure over time. And the second, and also in terms of changes in age at marriage, a first marriage, they're less problematic because if you're worried that if you use share or ever married by age 30, you can increase the age. You can go to 35 and 40, or you can choose the age for which your measure is not affected by the change in the age of first marriage. So let me show you that these problems are not only theoretical, they really happen in the data.
When you say married in the previous definition, you mean ever married? You mean currently married?
No,
so
ever married. So here,
okay, so if they marry and they divorce, they are in the
yes,
marriage.
we have the data for this. We know exactly whether they were married in the past. This is ever married. So let me show that this is an actual problem if you look at these measures. So and to plot the two measures used in the literature, we need to use the calendar year when the measure was computed. So for our measure, we need to use the year birth of the cohort. So to put them in the same graph, we take the year birth of the cohort and add 25 years. It doesn't change if you add 20 or 30 years. So you can see, let's look at the measure based on population, marriages divided by population. You can see that starting from 45, there is a huge decline in this measure. So the standard interpretation is that there was a huge decline in marriage rates during this period. But this is also the period of the baby boom, when you have this huge increase in population that explain at least a large part of this decline. If you look at the other two measures, actually marriage rates were increasing. Then if you look at the 60s, between the 60s and the 70s, this population-based measure experienced an increase, which was interpreted as an increase in marriage rates. But if you look at the other two measures, marriage rates actually were declining. And also at the end, it doesn't do very well because here there was an increase in the population. Now, the second measure does much better. It does very well. Only recently, after the 90s, it doesn't do well. And the reason is because in the 90s is when the age of first marriage started to increase. And this is why you see a decline in the cross-sectional measure, but an increase in our measure. So you see, this is not these are not theoretical problems. Those two measures can be problematic. Okay, so the evidence. So let's look first at the longitudinal variation. So the main results of the paper is that cohort size can explain on its own a large part of the variation in marriage rates over time. And we can do this. This measure can explain this large variation for both the black and the white population. Now, this is the graph I showed you earlier. So let me show you the graph by age 40. So even if you look at by age 40, you still have a similar strong correlation. We lose the correlation a little bit at the end here for women, and we need to work a little bit more on this, but we believe the reason is because this is the period where incarceration rates and mortality rates for black men went up a lot, so women had fewer black men to marry. So you can see that even if you look at age at this variables by age 40, you get similar results. Now, to see whether this correlation is statistically significant and how much of the variation we can explain, we ran a regression of the log share ever married on the log of cohort size. Well, let me point out that in the previous graph, we were using the share never married because it's easier to see in the graph a positive correlation. From now on, we will use the share ever married because it's easier to think in terms of this variable. Now here, we run this simple regression, log of share ever married on log of cohort size for different marriage markets, white men, white women, black women, and we looked at this for different age cutoff, 25, 30, 35, and 40. And here there are several results that I want to discuss. The first one is that you see everywhere we find a strong negative correlation between the cohort size and the share ever married. The second result is that if you look at the coefficients, they decline when we increase the age cutoff, which suggests that there is an effect of a change in the age of first marriage. So the one that we believe the most is by age 40, because by this age, most women, almost all women and men are married, in particular if you look at the white population.
So how does this change, say, for example, if you partition in different subperiods, and I assuming you're controlling for serial correlation on these are time series.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking more about the subperiods. Is this stable across subperiods? I mean, just breaking up over. This is like over the whole century.
When we started, we looked at subperiod. I don't remember. So if you look at the graph, it changes the correlation, which makes sense because if you think.
It looked like it. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
If you segment this over different subperiods, do you still find the same relationship?
Oh, we still find. Oh, yeah.
No, the same.
No, the same coefficient. You don't find the same coefficient, which makes sense. I'll tell you why. But you always find the strong negative correlation. You don't find the same coefficient.
And that's after controlling for the serial correlation. You're doing these time series observations. Now, how? I'm just curious. You didn't show a Durbin-Watson or something.
Yeah. So here, these are a standard regression.
Just treating each observation as independent?
As independent for this case. No, we allowed.
Econometrics.
No, but we allowed for serial correlation, and I don't remember if these are the results that we allowed or not, but the results are very similar.
Point estimates probably, but I wonder about the standard errors.
No, but we did that. But these numbers are the standard error shows more relative coefficient. But anyway, I can send you the results if you're worried about that. We did that in the past. I don't remember if these are the results that we have here controlling for that or not. I don't remember that. But if you look, so let me point out that if we
see, the point is you have this one variable that's highly non-stationary, which is this, I mean, the whole population has been increasing, right, over the sample. So, and the other variable is a share that's bounded between 0 and 1.
No, we bound the other one. We bound the cohort size between 0 and 1.
Well, you do?
Yeah, we bound cohort size between 0 and 1 to be able to run all these regressions.
Okay. Yeah, that's a deteriorating question. I'm just trying to get at the time series trends here going on. Otherwise, it's this highly non-stationary variable.
No,
variance is going to collapse almost
by
construction.
So what we did was we normalized it to be between 0 and 1. We ran a standard cointegration test to see whether they're cointegrated. They are cointegrated. So, but going back to the previous point, which is an important point. So if we break down this by periods, the coefficient makes sense that is different because if you think about, so this is difficult to tease out in the data, but you can think of this in the model. Think about a situation where you have a stable cohort size and then you have a cohort size that increases suddenly. And then think about a situation where you have a cohort size that has increased for the past 10 years. Now, the effect on the current marriage will be different because we have this crowding effect on the marriage market, right? So you don't expect this correlation to be the same over the same period.
But this is what the theoretical model should tell you.
The theoretical model does that.
So what does it predict? And in particular, the difference between black and white, the fact that the coefficients are completely different across black and white, is it predicted by the theoretical model?
So that's a good point. And the theoretical model now uses the, we make the assumption that cohort size is identical for men and women, which is true for whites. We have another paper where we relax the assumption and we make a number of men smaller than number of women for each cohort size, and then we can generate the difference. But that's another paper, not this one.
It seems like you should be looking at relative cohort sizes from one period to the next, not absolute. You're taking absolute cohort size, scaling it 0 to 1. It sounds like your theory is a theory about relative cohort size from one period to the next. So it seems like you might want to be regressing something like the log changes in cohort size, which would get rid of your co-integration also.
Yeah, yeah, implicitly with this regression we are capturing, right, the change from one year to the other. What you're suggesting is that to run it directly, the change in cohort size on...
It sounds like your theory is a theory about relative cohort sizes. It's not a theory about absolute cohort sizes.
Okay, we can do it to get rid of the time series, but our theory is about the level, not only about the change. The levels comes in, and you have this crowding out effect. It's not about the change.
Isn't what matters whether it's 10% bigger from one to the next, not whether the absolute number is 1 million larger in one than the next?
I'm not sure. The model is non-linear, so I'm not sure whether the level of... So we can try running the changes on changes. So yeah, the other result I want you to point out is something that Pierre-André already pointed out, that the results for the coefficient for blacks are larger than the coefficient for whites. Part of the reason is because the fraction of black individuals who get married is smaller than for whites, and part of the explanation is because we have fewer men in each cohort that enter the marriage market because of incarceration rates and mortality rates.
I'm sorry, I wasn't saying difference to both of these variables. I was saying the changes in, yeah, log cohort size, difference log cohort size, not difference log share.
Okay.
Just right-hand side.
Okay, yeah, we can do that.
I don't understand, when all the future cohort sizes matter, as long as you're alive for whatever that period is, and we thought about the life cycle, right? I mean, they should matter to differing extent depending on your preferences for age. And
that's exactly why you're going to get this change in the age, the matching, right? What happens to the age gap between men and women?
Yeah, so you're right. So here we are looking at one particular cohort size with one particular marriage rate. So yeah,
I care about the next 3-4 cohorts, 10-year cohorts.
You could be doing 10-year differences or 20-year differences.
So we will show you the 10 years differences, but it's difference on difference for the results at the state level. So here we have the results. Oh, 10 is better. Okay, I have 10. So here the results. The results for the longitudinal variation suggest that there is strong correlation. So now we provide some additional evidence using cross-state variation. And the idea is very simple. If a cohort size generates changes in the share ever married, then we should also see that the states with a larger cohort size should have a lower share of individual ever married. So we try to do this, to look at this in the data, and notice that.
Migration by education, by higher education.
Yeah.
There's got to be a national market for these colleges.
Absolutely. So there is an endogeneity problem created by migration. This is why instead of using the cohort size at the time of when they enter the market, we look at the number of births. So we use this as a proxy for the number of individuals that enter the market when they decide to get married. So you see? So to avoid this correlation, we use the number of births in a particular state, not the number of individuals in that particular state when they are 20.
I mean, you're thinking of using it as an instrument. What's relevant is the number of participants in the state at the time they're making the marriage decision.
That's true, but...
and you might want to instrument that with this other variable.
Yeah, so we will do that later, okay? We instrument that later. For the moment, we'll show you the results using this as a proxy, okay? But you see the results with this. So for this, we cannot use the CPS because at the state level, we have too few observations. So we need to use censuses. Unfortunately, we don't have the variable we were using before for the 1990 and 2000 censuses. We don't have this recall variable age at first marriage. So we can only construct the share ever married for this decennial cohorts. So what we do is we compute 10-year differences in both variables, in cohort size and the share ever married, and then we regress one on the other. So the results that we get when we look at the cross-state variation are similar to what we had before. So you can see that the coefficient is still negative and strongly significant. It's larger for blacks than for whites, and it declines when we increase the age cutoff. So, and here the coefficient is slightly smaller than what we had before, which suggests that the proxy is not as good now that we have migration across states, relative to what we had before, where we had only migration from and to the US. But the results are still consistent with what we found before. Now, so now in the last 4 minutes, we try to use some exogenous variation to instrument the changes in births at the state level. And if you think about an actual story that can generate a bias in our results, it's not easy to come up with a story that goes in the direction of the coefficients that we find. In particular, here, notice that what we find is that births in a particular year affects marriage rates 20, 30 years later. So we're not worried about reverse causality. We're worried about some omitted variables. But all the omitted variables seems to suggest a positive correlation instead of a negative one. If you think about persistent income, you will have more births today and more marriages tomorrow. Fertility technologies, let's say at the state level, states with higher preferences for families will adopt this less, so that we have more births and therefore more marriages tomorrow. So all this seems to suggest a positive coefficient, but you can always come up with a possible story. So we try to find some source of exogenous variation, and we use the mobilization rates, changes in mobilization rates across the states during World War II. So given that I only have 2 minutes, let me show you the results. So here we're trying to understand how mobilization rates could affect the birth rates. They can affect them in different ways, but let me go to the results. So to construct the mobilization rates, we only use white men because the deployment rates for black individuals was not large enough. And so we need to have a racial breakdown for the mobilization rates. In the selective survey special monographs, we only have a racial breakdown for whites and blacks for the draft registration and for the inductions. So for people that were selected, were drafted, but we don't have this difference, this separation between black and whites for people that enlisted. So
you're taking out a subset of your time series. These are the people who would be affected by this instrument.
Absolutely.
This isn't going to change the 1980 cohort data.
No. This is only
only for this very limited chunk of time.
This is only during the war. Absolutely. Yeah. I'll show you the results. They only for the war. So the way we construct the mobilization rate is men inducted divided by the number of white men registered. Okay.
So you're saying that's exogenous? I mean, I'm not quite sure. I don't know the determinant of the mobilization. I assume it's education, physical health.
Here it is. So what generated the differences in mobilization rates across states? So So here, it's important to know that how this draft was organized. So there was one centralized organization, the Selective Service System, who organized a local draft, and this central system gave guidelines and directives to the local drafts, but the local draft had a lot of authority over who to draft. And part of the variation.
But what the rates were very high during this war, though, right?
The rates of what?
The rates of drafting these people.
Oh yeah, it was very high.
No, I mean, I'm just saying how much variation really was there across these states. You're going to show.
I'll show you. Yeah, I'll show you.
Seems very
the next slide.
Strong.
So we have enough variation.
Okay, I'm surprised.
I'll show you in the next slide, okay? So, so we have this, first of all, we have idiosyncratic differences in local boards, which is the type of variation that we want to use. There are differences in age across states.
So what happens in boards where you have people volunteering, then the draft rate goes down, right? I mean, that's like a quota for the state, some notion. So if one state's very patriotic, they're going to, you know, the mobilization rate would go down as you're measuring, I guess. I'm just trying to understand.
True. That's true, but as long as it's not correlated with...
yeah, but is it? I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
Next slide, we'll talk. I'll show you the results. So 0, I'm a 0. Okay. Then there are differences in particular concentrations, and this is what worries us: exemption for farmers and differences in occupational structure, because this can be persistent over time and affect marriage rate later on. So we try to look at observables, so to see what kind of observables can be affected. What observable can be different across states. So what we do here, we divide the states in low mobilization rate, medium, and high mobilization rates. And you see that there is quite some variation in mobilization rates. These are only averages within the states. And we find two variables that are statistically different across groups. One is age, which should not be a problem for us. The other is education. That could be a problem, because if education is persistent, then this can affect marriage later on. So what we do in our regressions, we control for years of educations, and to be on the safe side, we also control for the shares farmers and log income in a flexible way.
Do you have a map, by the way, of the states that are low?
Certainly.
Do you have a map that shows the states that have low draft rates?
I don't have it.
I'm wondering whether the low draft rates are essentially related to health conditions.
I don't have that.
So, for
I look
example,
at
they
that.
might be concentrated in the south. Yeah, that would be.
I mean, they just weren't eligible. I mean,
Exactly. That's what I'm
just because of
Yeah, but so the only one...
mental and physical health, both actually, big sources of disability. That was true in India.
I can look at the map and show you. I haven't looked. So let me show you the results. So here you can see that the only periods for which we can look at this is between the 1940 and 1950. So this is the first stage, and let me show you directly the second stage. So these are the results that we get, which are consistent with the previous results. So we find the negative coefficients in all cases. In all specification that we use, we find the negative coefficient, which is strongly significant. So even if we use this, what we think is arguably exogenous variation, we have this negative coefficient. So here we control for using education interactive with the polynomial in time trend, which is supposed to capture possible divergences in all these variables that you're worried about. Okay, so the results with the exogenous variation are consistent with the previous one. We still have this negative relationship between cohort size and the share ever married. And I'll stop here.
Yes, I have a question, thank you. So I have a question about the model. You say the value of marriage declines faster for women, and this is driven by the fact that the period of fertility is shorter. So what is the role of, and that the purpose of marriage is to have children, what is the role of children? Is it to provide instantaneous utility, or is it to provide utility through time? Do you account for life for the fact that life expectancy of men is
So,
lower.
so in the model that we use is very simple in this regard. So when two individuals is a standard search model where when a husband and two potential spouses meet, they draw a particular match quality, which stays the same throughout the period. Okay, so match quality, kids are included in this match quality.
Okay, but so if you account for the fact that the period of time during which men are going to enjoy the benefits of having had children is shorter on average than that for women, then you don't have anymore that the value of marriage declines.
Say it again. Why shouldn't happen?
Because men are going to be
They're going to die sooner.
They're going to die sooner. So if the value of children is something that occurs through time, then the value of marriage cannot decline faster. Well, may, but this is going to play in the other direction. So I was wondering whether.
Yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought about that. So what you're saying is that men can enjoy their kids for fewer periods. So maybe, yeah, it's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, yeah, but I understand. But it's worth thinking about that. Yeah.
So you're using the model to generate some empirical predictions. I mean, is there any sense in which you have an ambition to be able to say something about the value of being born in a particular sequence for a male or female? Because in the end, if I say, okay, they're married more, they're married less, I mean, maybe they're worse welfare status.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in this paper, we provide the empirical evidence and we test the model, and to be able to talk more about welfare issues and policies, we should use a model that thinks a little bit more about the issues that were raised earlier. So how we need to have more stages instead of than one, as you mentioned earlier, and to think a little bit more carefully about what generates the cohort changes. But you're right, that's an important topic. But for this paper, it's probably too much.